So today's event lays out the foundation for sustainability as a strategic priority for businesses. So leading off the sustainability series, I'm quite excited to introduce to all of you our first speaker, Mr. Peadar Duffy. He joins us from Ireland. Hi, Peadar, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Vantage Point. So Peadar is an international environmental, social, and corporate ESG governance risk expert. As a recognized thought leader with a track record in international collaboration and standards development, Peadar's leadership roles include serving as the global ESG practice lead at Archer IRM, the world's largest governance risk compliance GRC platform provider. In today's event also, he'll be joined by author and entrepreneur, Mary Adams. Mary, welcome to Vantage Point as well. Thank you for joining us. Mary herself joins us from Boston, so there's an Irish connection going on here today on this Vantage Point. Throughout her career, Mary has held various executive level positions at Citicorp, Sanwa as a high-risk lender in the US and Latin America. She's also the co-founder of Insight 7, which caters to organizations wanting to optimize financial and ESG performance. We're grateful to have both Peadar and Mary join us and share their thoughts and guidance on the subject of how sustainable business is not only good for the planet, but also for the goodness of their business as well. So before turning the floor over to Peadar, I want to invite all our viewers to ask any questions they have by using your Q&A icon. So please, your Q&A icon, type your questions. And now, without further ado, I want to invite Peadar to the virtual stage. Peadar, thank you and welcome again to the Vantage Point, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and for that introduction. And let me just introduce myself. Can you see my screen okay? It's rendered correctly?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. So thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to the conversation with Mary. I guess my objective here is I'd like to level set the whole kind of ESG, sustainability, provide a context, and help people understand that whereas for many people, ESG is something which they might feel has happened overnight, that in fact it's been some decades in the making for reasons that will become apparent pretty shortly. And I largely want to just provide coordinates. People will be able to access the deck. And there are lots of authoritative sources that you'll be able to click into and research yourself and so forth. I don't believe in Peadarisms or any other ism. I tend to like leaning in on those authoritative sources and then making sense of them. I guess lots of people would be able to view that, something happened around COVID-19, that all of a sudden, as we were settling into remote working, we were hearing more and more and more about this thing of ESG and climate and so forth. If you could see where I'm sitting in my home, in my sitting room, you'd see from some paraphernalia on the wall behind me that I've got a military background. And about 45 years ago, when I was a young officer cadet in our military college, one of the first lectures we received from our brigadier was that the next World War would be about water and resources. And he wasn't talking about back then in the 70s about the Middle East. It was a broader context. When I worked in the States with the folk in the reinsurance business in particular, the one category of risk above all that would really terrify them would be that related to weather, cat risk, and so forth. So there's no new news. There's really no new news with regards to climate and weather as things that have been causing people give them cause for concern for the last decades. But let's just talk, first of all, to kind of information that's been available, in particular to the pension funds, because they're the folk that have leaned in heavily, rolled in heavily with their money, because they're looking for a safe place to put it and because they've got a fiduciary obligation for all of us here that are on this call. They tend to take long-term views, and they find that the methodologies they've been using, Murray can speak to this with huge authority later on, that those methodologies, they're becoming concerned that they're not fit for purpose. They look, for example, over the last number of years at the shortening lifespans of organizations. I read a report from one of the World Economic Forum reports, I think it was in 2019, where it spoke about the fact that we're living in the 21st century through 20,000 years of technology advancement in this 100-year period, adjusted for pace of change. And the impact of AI, for example, in businesses, banks, for example, having to reimagine how they provide, how they sell money to consumers in particular. So there's a lot of change. Equally, over the last number of years, we've seen an increase in the growth, a very sharp increase in the growth of intangible assets as in the context of total value of businesses. In fact, the organization called IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, it put out a white paper about 3 years ago, perhaps 2 years ago now, essentially making the case that the title of Chief Financial Officer is possibly going to change relatively quickly, because if the minority of 10% or less, depending on the sector you're in, of the assets underpinning the total value of the business are intangible in nature, and the chief financial officer historically is used to counting money, binary, we have it in the bank or we don't. And if the intangibles are more difficult as they are to parameterize than money, then the chief financial officer perhaps needs to become a chief value officer. I'm a commissioner in a thing called the Value Commission. And we're busy at the moment. We're a time-bound project in the development of a database that would be available open source to the world, with effect from the end of this year, we would hope, providing access to value factors, things that need to be considered, and helping to reduce the burden for the finance function. That's only a tiny piece of what's happening in the overall kind of value accounting, impact investing scene. Again, I'm just painting the picture here in the context of what's been known for some considerable time. So then, enter COVID-19, and basically that had the effect of the chickens coming home to roost, because here we had a single event that basically stopped the world in its tracks. And we learned so much about how supply chains, how long and fragile they are, where certain activities are kind of centered in certain parts of the world, and how close the dominoes are stacked. And that kind of precipitated, it introduced a kind of a sense of urgency, almost a sense that we're sitting on a burning platform here, right? We have these kind of a Venn, as I describe here, pace of change in the context of AI-driven change or technology-driven change, climate that we hear about so much in our news feeds every day. We're also conscious of the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. And as I say, a hungry man becomes an angry man. And we see lots of evidence of that in the developed world. So we have this world that's growing in uncertainty. And in the context, if I just look at that then through one lens, right? The climate lens. We have the UN's IPCC, and basically we have essentially hundreds of scientists around the world working in universities, research entities, and so forth, working on modeling climate impacts. And every 3 to, or rather every 5 to 7 years, the IPCC produces a report saying, right, based on what we know today, these are the scenarios that we anticipate for tomorrow. And there are hundreds or 400 such scenarios, but largely speaking, when the climate analysts look at these and they try and help companies, for reasons I'll explain at the end of my talk, help companies to understand how they can test the resiliency of their business model, of their strategies against these scenarios. What they use is they access metadata and they create what they call these RCPs, these representative concentration pathways. Here we have 4 kind of pathways. It might be difficult to see just there on my screen show, but when you download the document, and either way, you'll be able to just click the link and get access to this yourselves. On the right-hand side here, you've got a kind of an ambition that we could limit a temperature increase to 2 degrees in alignment with what we call the Paris Agreement. There's virtually nobody who understands what's going on in the world today that today believes we can hit 2 degrees. It's not just going to happen. And that we're heading dangerously close to 4 degrees on our current trajectory. And in Ireland, for example, Little Green Ireland, the Queen Shamrock and all of that, the southeast of our country will be prone to drought as a matter of, has become a new norm for us in about 30, 40 years' time. But here's the thing in terms of impact on business. Whereas the worst of the physical manifestations of climate are likely to be quite a number of years away, decades, and you might say, well, I'd be gone before that happens. The reality is that transition risks are hitting companies today. An example of a transition risk is the proposed SEC rule that will be published now after the public consultation exposure period. That will be published in April, we're told. The Europeans have produced their regulatory framework already, and the rest of the world will produce its kind of regulatory frame in June. Because the reality is that the numbers, I mean, there's truth, not so much, the truth is in the trends, okay? It's not a report that you get at a point in time, but the trends. And we can see that there's a delta between we've all have heard the 2050 net zero declarations that companies raced out to announce with great fanfare and publicity and so forth. But the reality is none of them realized how tough it's going to be. You can't dial down your carbon emissions as if it's kind of a dimmer switch in your room. If you're a business that's embedded in the fossil fuel economy, most are, and you have to transition to green economy, that requires business transformation. That's very, very, very tough. So this is the type of stuff that is, and by the way, one other little slide here, these are the assumptions that at a macro level underpin what we call carbon budgeting, right? There are things called science-based targets. Now, by the way, mind you now, I'm just talking about looking at ESG through one very narrow lens, weather. That's a piece of the E only, okay? There's a whole lot of other stuff in the E bucket, other stuff in the S bucket, and other stuff in the G bucket. And so the particular assumptions that are made with regards to what's going to happen at an industry sector level in terms of dialing down these emissions and new technologies that people assume will become available, green aviation fuel, for example, at an industrial scale. All of these assumptions today are what people are feverishly working to realizing, okay? A lot of these assumptions here are being challenged day in and day out. There's little conviction, little confidence that enough of them are going to kick in at the time that they're required, because this is time bound, to help. So the pension funds and the capital markets, what's the response? Well, there's more money is ESG funds, ESG assets under management. There's a kind of a fair bit of kind of tomfoolery going on there. You hear about the term greenwashing. But what that means is that someone who says, we're doing 1, 2, and 3. We're leaning in on just renewable energy, for example. Just like a very narrow slice, an extraordinarily narrow slice of the overall challenge. Find that you're learning afterwards that is just not the case. In Europe, which is leading the charge, regulation, Europe has introduced a thing called the EU taxonomy, basically a classification system. It is very deep, very dense, very complex, being fully embraced by all European Union member countries. It'll be passed, and the one aspect of it, they call the CSRD, we passed into law in June of this year. 12,000 companies, the biggest 12,000 in Europe, would be required to report all of their E, S, and G metrics. It's hundreds and thousands of data points for each individual company. And if they're spread across multiple geographies, multiply that by an order of great magnitude. So it's a big data challenge. Those 12,000 will be followed by about 38,000 shortly afterwards. So we have 50,000 companies, 12,000 reporting in 2025 on the 24 ESG metrics. And the idea is that the pension funds and the big funds in particular are using ESG as an additional input to the methodologies they're already using to help them better understand the long-term viability of those companies that they're investing in today. They know that they can't exit overnight. For example, businesses, coal mining and so forth, because we need coal. We need it. So there's a transition effect taking place. But I was working with recently, wearing my Archer hat, with a very, very significant mortgage provider in the States, hugely significant. And they're well used to looking at where the risks are concentrated from, weather risk and so forth, because they've got an insurance arm as well. And after a hurricane or whatever, they experience losses there. But they're at a point of cusp almost now where they'll no longer be able to write mortgages, right? And in certain parts of the country. And the consequence of that is that as soon as that is known, it will have an adverse effect on stock values, because the value of existing mortgages will go down. In any event, that's just to share make the point, as it were, that ESG really is all about the money, primarily because of concerns about weather and stuff, but it's all about protecting, because the fiduciary obligation and duty of directors of the funds. So this is just an example here of the four. This comes from TCFD. An example of a little table showing the climate-related transition events. Now, what is the TCFD? So a bunch of years ago, the G7 finance ministers asked the mother of all central banks, the Financial Stability Board, to do something, given concerns about the impact of weather on the global economy and collapses that are potentially precipitated by those weather events, to do something. And it created the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. That's what this acronym here is, TCFD. And that T is the North Star of the big three ESG related kind of regulatory frameworks that we're in the first half of this year we've brought to bear. The SEC rule, proposed SEC rule, what's happening in Europe called CSRD, and the rest of the world thing called ISB, which is a sister of the International Accounting Standards Board. What I would say to you is that whereas we're hearing a lot about weather and about ESG, the real train that's left the station is the train that's to do with corporate reporting. Because the day of the financial report being the principal instrument that investors use to form an opinion on the viability of an enterprise they're considering investing in or getting out of, or whatever, that day is now being sunset. Because the corporate report of the future will not be a financial report, it'll be a general report. Because we're looking at the integration of financial information and sustainability related non-financial information. It's all about sustainability over the longer term. And producing more information within that general report, machine readable information, such that investors and all the other stakeholders, employees, prospective employees, suppliers, contractors, partners, can be fully informed as to the long-term viability of the enterprise. This here is an illustration of the kind of the alphabet soup. It's just a fraction, by the way, small fraction attributed here to Deloitte, friends in France here in particular. It's a very fine representation of the different global initiatives, voluntary initiatives. You see TCFD, which is an North Star I explained earlier. The international financial regulations here. There's a consolidation taking place here now. But this alphabet soup that companies had to contend with up until the end of 2026. But that now, given the acute level of concerns that's held at the level of the G7, G20, and the markets, has been consolidated now to a much cleaner picture of, as I said, the SEC proposed SEC rule, the ESG regs that will be law, that is certain in June, and then the rest of the world here with ISB. And in the center here, you've got the North Star, which I mentioned. I'm going to show you a bit more in detail. You have the UN Sustainable Development Goals here. CDP is interesting. Just some weeks ago, White House announced another rule for federal suppliers. 18,600 companies that provide services and goods to US federal companies. The US today is known to be the largest single kind of procurer of stuff, 650 billion. And so on a kind of a graded basis, depending on the size of your contracts, you will be required to report your emissions, your carbon emissions. Essentially, when you get your electricity bill in your home today, whenever you get your electricity bill, you go online, you look at it, you're nearly always now going to see the emissions associated with your consumption of energy. So that multiplied by an order of great magnitude, companies now will have to report on CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. It's a reporting platform. Been around for some considerable time. The UK, as we know, left the European Union, but it is introducing its own legislation to be effectively a mirror image of what's happening in Europe. So we've gone from this kind of messiness to this clarity. And there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, task force in particular with regards to data management, on aligning taxonomies here, US, rest of the world, and Europe. A huge amount of work. And an organization that I'm involved in called the ESG Exchange. I'm chair of the technical committee of that exchange. We are the platform, the environment where that task force resides, doing this alignment work here. Okay. The reason we call it the exchange, by the way, the ESG Exchange, is because the world is now being required to do in a handful of years that was done over decades in the whole area of financial control administration and a particular audit. We must do that in a fraction of that time, in a handful of years. And companies don't know how to do it. And so there's a requirement for a massive collaboration, exchanges of knowledge, experience, the actual standards themselves, the regulations. And effectively, if it feels like we're constructing the plane as it's in mid-flight, that would be a fair representation. And there's nobody would disagree with that. No one organization fully understands what they need to do, because ESG really, it is shorthand for sustainability over the longer term, but ESG are just really all those kind of non-financial operational things. And that's what all the E stuff, S stuff, and G stuff, all the operational things you have to do to achieve a financial outcome. But they all now need to be parameterized, they all are through standards, aggregate the information, and so forth. This here is representation of what a typical organization looks like today. And is to provide a sense, this would be a medium-sized large organization, quite frankly. If you take 60,000 multinational corporations and the 500,000 subsidiaries that they control, that accounts for half the world's global economy. And their value chains extend over tens of thousands of suppliers, and they are required to report on it. This reflects a multinational corporation. They're also required to report on certain metrics associated with the tens of thousands of suppliers that they're relied upon. This is just to convey the idea of data as a challenge. When I spoke about TCFD, I'm conscious now of time. When I spoke about TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, this thing created by the mother of all central banks, it realized something. It said, you know something? This doesn't require any new thinking. This just requires that we do better those things that have always been understood. Governance, strategy, risk management. ESG is just old risk management wine in a new bottle called the ESG bottle. Metrics and targets. And these four pillars give rise to just 11 recommendations. 11 recommendations, that's all. And these recommendations here are what you will find in the current proposed SEC, CSRD in Europe, and ISB for the rest of the world. So, as you learned from the beginning of the conversation, my day job is in a software company. We were bought out of Dell EMC just 2 years ago by a private equity house. And we're the world's largest governance risk compliance platform. You know, like 80% out of the Fortune 500 use 2 or 3 of our use cases. So in my private role, my private life as a non-exec, I'm in this ESG Exchange. And I developed this thing called the value stack. So we call it the Archer ESG value stack. But if you click that link, it'll bring into the ESG Exchange. Why do we do this? This is the cornerstone. This is my last slide. This is the cornerstone of the approach being taken in the ESG Exchange with regards to addressing the data challenge, this data elephant challenge. Because when we look at TCFD, when I looked at TCFD and the regulations and the standards and all that kind of good stuff, from a systems perspective, because companies, directors of companies don't like uncertainty. They want more certainty than uncertainty. But when we look at the data challenge, what you realize is that all these regulations require that companies basically develop systems that do effectively 5 things. Okay? These 5 things are explicitly called out in TCFD. This might look like a maturity model. In fact, it's not. It's 5 phases with feedback loops and all that kind of stuff. But at the bottom of the stack is the requirement to gather data. Truth is, most organizations don't know where all their E, S, and G data. They have a high degree of confidence where most of the G stuff is, because that's pretty mature. Low to no confidence at all that they can see. Nobody has end-to-end visibility of all the systems where the stuff resides. But that is what is required. assuming you get to a point pretty quickly, and by the way, with the provision of independent third-party assurance required, again in Europe with effect in 2025, independent audit. Okay, the lower threshold of audit, there's limited assurance and reasonable assurance. Limited assurance is the first hurdle. Tough, even though it is just limited and not reasonable. But all this stuff here will have to be audited. Okay. The next phase then is transition and transformation planning, because the markets don't really care that you said you're going to be net, at kind of climate neutral or net zero rather by 2050. They don't really care about that because they don't believe it. They want to know, show us your 2025 numbers, or 2030 numbers, or 35 numbers, right? And we just don't want a PowerPoint or a PDF, or we want to be able to drill into your numbers because we want machine readable reports. Okay. And we've added in here transition and transformation planning to emphasize the point. It's about business transformation. Scenario analysis, and I made reference to the RCPs earlier on, that really is about, there's a lot of science changing. There's a lot of variables. There's a lot of stuff. Points of view and understandings are changing all the time. The truth, however, is in the trends, because the trends aren't changing, sadly. So the requirement there is to undertake a formal scenario analysis. For example, I spent 3.5 hours last week with a top 4 on a joint bid to a Fortune 100, and saying, right, we'll do the analysis. You've given us your inventory of assets, your physical locations around the whole world, hundreds of them, including 100 sub campuses. And we will identify those potential assets because we have the GPS locations of each, height above sea level. The issue mightn't be sea rise. The issue could be, well, actually now, a lowering water table. Okay? Or didn't realize that this particular facility is built on a floodplain, for example. And being able to ensure that your supply chain is not adversely exposed and that you've thought things through, right? So the next piece then, I've made reference to corporate reporting, this general report integration of financial and non-financial, and this last point then is your ESG story. And I do acknowledge that I've spoken here primarily of ESG through the climate stroke weather lens. There aren't enough hours in the day to talk about all the other lenses, but it's a good proxy for the other challenges. So I hope that I've kind of provided a sense of where this whole thing has come from, why the concern today, how it translates into business impacts, and Mary's talk and Mark will begin to talk about how corporates are responding to this and the business model impacts that need to be entertained and addressed. So with that, I'm over time. I apologize. I'll stop sharing and happy to take Mary's challenges or her queries or anything else that a person might like to ask from the audience. Mary, right?
Yeah. Thank you. And there are some amazing questions, so I don't want to dominate, but I'll just make a few comments. I think that was a great introduction to this amazing tidal wave, this force coming at companies that has to be a catalyst for change. And there are a few questions in the chat about the intangible assets, right? Because you put that out there, and I think that's the connective tissue in many ways between the climate. You focused rightly because markets are focusing on it. The world is focusing on climate, but there's some fundamental changes happening in how we do business, and you can really see it there in the intangible. So I think I guess I would challenge you to say, even if you took away everything with the market, there's still a reason to change. And how does that tie back to the capitals?
Well, I guess as you and I are both intimately familiar with the capitals, the idea that financial capital is the only capital is clearly gone. You clearly see from that. And but so what's kind of accepted now, the proofs are coming, but what's accepted now is that there are a minimum 4, if not 6 capitals, right? And your business model needs to be understood through each one of those capitals. It's relatively easy to work out what kind of capital we need to have, what capital is at risk. We all know that, if we leave the money, as it were, under the mattress and hope that it will retain its value for 10 years' time, that clearly won't work. So we've got to take risk with our capital. But we know that if we put financial capital at risk, it's only because we believe that our other capitals are enhanced, become more resilient, they endure over time. So the requirement on for example, I'm an editor of a thing called ISO 37000. Again, another one of these big collaborations that took place because we looked at all the governance codes and corporate governance codes from around the world and they wanted one. Didn't quite get to the point of codifying the others, but and it's a principles-led guidance. But the second principle in there is on the whole area of value creation, right? And we collaborated with the AICPA in taking their business model framework that speaks about the 4 corners of value creation and preservation. And built within that, you have the understanding of the 6 capitals in that context and how those capitals on the input side of the business model change by, through activities and inputs and the outcomes on the other end. So the conversation is changing. I know, Mary, that your business, Insight 7, is you basically you digitalized all of that. You understanding it as you do. You provided these tools to help companies actually. How do we get our heads around this stuff? How do we provide these measurements around this stuff? So, and truthfully, there are people today sitting in rooms all around the world, dozens of hundreds of people and dozens of different task groups that are trying to work to come to a consensus internationally in the whole area of value accounting. Right? We've nailed financial accounting. We're now talking about value accounting. So all of that is work in progress. There's nothing definitive yet in the world. But maybe you could speak to it yourself in the context of, integrated thinking and the intangibles. What's your perspective?
So, I think that we should define when we jumped into our little private, vocabulary of the capitals, but the idea that a company's relying on resources that are more than financial. Obviously, we have physical assets, that's a kind of capital. That's an owned one. Technology is a really important one. Then, and all that entails, data, knowledge, and, people have different names for that, intellectual capital, structural. But then you have all your relationships with your employees, with your customers, with your suppliers, with your communities, and all of those are assets and resources that you need to survive, but you don't own them, you don't control them, and then finally, obviously there's the environment. And so I think for me that graph is showing, that only 10% of the value is fixed assets on the balance sheet, that it's not about what you own and control, it's about all these other factors. And that's why there's so much risk and uncertainty in the world right now and in business, because we don't control it. And so you have to think about, I can't just optimize for profitability and forget about these other resources because I'm going to need them. And if you need them in the future, you have to actually care about them. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here.
And just think of the challenge for management teams. Hard enough keep the business going in a business as usual context, and now they are required to talk to articulate their understanding of the business model through these capitals, understand stuff, use words they never used before, use them in the absence of any internationally agreed measurement criteria. That's why I'm working in the Value Commission voluntarily on the whole thing of value factors. And it's the whole sense of, wow, we have to commit to all this. We have to do it because we have to change because of the urgency of the situation. But we literally are building the plane in mid-flight. We have an engine and two wings and a cockpit and someone at the front, but we're nailing down the seats as we're flying, pretty much learning how to do that. So there's no complete answer. It's tough.
Yeah, systems thinking is really kind of the order of the day, and it's not easy. But that's when you show your network graph of the complex organization. I mean, that's what we're trying to all do, and I think your example, that we're talking so much about environmental, but then you look at what happened to Southwest Airlines recently. They weren't paying attention to their intellectual capital, to their systems, and as much as they should have, apparently. Then you're missing. You can't just have your eye on one or two balls. You've got to find ways to see the whole system. So, Rachel, I know.
So the dashboard, and the dashboard now has become just far more complex.
Yeah.
Before we had a financial dashboard, that was tough enough. Now we have more things that we have to factor into our decision making. Absolutely.
Rachel, there's some amazing questions here.
There really are. And again, I have to thank you both for introducing this subject to our Vantage Point series and just highlight the fact that this is the first of a continued conversation on this topic. So the wonderful opportunity here is to have this continued dialogue with the both of you and other thought leaders in this sustainability space. So we'll get to as many of the audience questions as possible, knowing that, again, this will be a continued conversation that we'll touch on in subsequent series. Since this first and kickoff event, Peadar and Mary, since it focused on the strategic side of and the why to adopt perhaps this ESG and sustainability concept, let me focus on some questions in that space. The first being this question coming in from the audience: do you see leadership in business, education, and other industries, obviously aviation being one of them, do you see those elements transforming as a part of really the heart and soul of the business from the old economic model towards more of a people, planet, profit type of strategy? Can you speak to that briefly?
I would say, I mean, I was talking to someone that just maybe I think it was about 6 months ago, and he was remarking, he's an IR person, investor relations person, and he was saying that up until just even 3 or 4 years ago, ESG as a kind of a topic, and it's just shorthand for sustainability, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, that it came up in kind of under AOB and sometimes not at all in the analysts kind of quarterly briefings that the CEO and the CFO would do. Now it's in the first 15 minutes, right? Because there's such fear on the part of the analysts because they've got a job to do, they've got an obligation to ensure that they really do understand all the things that they need to understand, because they're putting, your money and mine at risk, right, in that entity. So the business schools themselves today, there isn't any body of knowledge. So the business schools, for example, are part of the ESG Exchange and so many other initiatives as well, because the idea of the exchange, which is a not-for-profit, its mission, its purpose is to move the sustainability dial across 10,000 multinational corporations. We didn't say 60,000, it's all of them. We said 10,000. But in that 10,000, 1 million managers, right? And bringing, helping, transferring knowledge to them in terms of the fundamentals, sustainability fundamentals. So, and quite a number of the colleges are involved with the initiative, because ultimately, it's up to the corporates. The corporates have to make sense of this, right? And the giants, Standard Chartered, even Amaro and so forth, the non-Unilever and so forth, these are organizations that have done so much, but they would acknowledge that they're just scratching the surface. So the book has yet to be written. And in fact, the purpose of the ESG Exchange is to produce how-to playbooks. So that body of knowledge is being written as we speak. And in the meantime, transparency, collaboration, openness is required within boundaries to ensure that companies, are, whilst contending with business as usual, are getting their heads around this whole new kind of paradigm. It's a paradigm. Mary, what do you think?
So I the way I like to put it is that the financial markets are driving a lot of change right now. I think businesses would be doing it on their own, but that incredible momentum that Peadar showed in his slide of creating standards and all that, that's because the large investors have realized that there are fundamental risks, climate and social risks, that cannot be diversified out of. And so if you're a finance person, you look at that and you say, the only way that we're going to preserve on behalf of our investors the value in these portfolios is to focus on these issues and drive systems change, not change in individual companies, or not just change in individual companies. You can't invest in a good company and offset a bad company and say you've done your work to protect your investors. And so it's coming. It's a hard business issue. Many of us are also passionate about it for a lot of other reasons. But in this context, it's a business issue, and there's no turning your back up.
That makes sense. And I think that kind of drives into the conversation that we'll have in our very next event, which more so focuses in on that, the goals and outcomes of these strategic and strategy initiatives that are centering and circling around ESG. To kind of preview that conversation, could either of you give, in this audience that comes from the audience question, could you either of you give an example or an outcome of a sustainable financial practice or finance practice?
Mary, you're previewing your own.
Right. So finance, there's finance for the market, like investors, and then internal finance functions. So I think we've given a pretty good view today of kind of that outside in view, thinking inside out. One of the things that I will talk about is that really, if you had one question to ask a company about whether they're really doing this or they're just talking about it, is ask how sustainability is integrated into their financial decisioning process. How are you deciding to allocate resources internally, whether it's people, attention, buildings, and what is your investment, your capital expenditure, your operating expenses? How is that approval process considering not just the pure financial considerations, but how do you balance? I talk about kind of it's three balls that you're juggling. You're juggling the financial, the operational, and the sustainability. And when you talk about dramatic things like, I read an article last week about changing aviation planes to run on air. That was a new one for me. That means, we've taken for granted a lot of things, and our decision processes are now being really challenged because we have to be able to consider many more variables, and how do you optimize for a number of variables rather than just saying, oh, well, we know financial is so that gets back to what Peadar talked about, this idea about, should the finance function be really a value function? And we, in our platform, we have a function and a focus on what we call sustainable value. And that's basically saying we can't just be responsible for that 10% that we can, on the balance sheet that we got pinned down, that you have to start thinking about the whole, the rest of it, the 90% as well. And so for me, that's a conceptual introduction, but to really quickly, I mean, the way it would look, a concrete example is we're going to change our fuel. What does that do to our operations? What does that do to our people? How does it change what, our processes? And hopefully, and obviously it doesn't change our carbon footprint. So it's being able to bring in the right data and make the decisions that are considering all those factors.
And thank you for mentioning that connection there for us, Mary. We're actually going to get into that conversation into more depth, I believe, in session 4 later at the end of the year, where we kind of apply this concept of sustainability to the aviation and aerospace conversation. So let's kind of table that and put some application there in that future conversation. Some of the other questions that are coming in are drilling down to the individual level, perhaps the impact on us. And again, I'll offer another preview to our very final session that we will offer in this series at the end of the year, focusing on sustainability and the individual role that people play. But just to kind of get your initial thoughts, Mary and Peadar, on this topic of how this might impact us, 2 questions come in on this space, and I'll try to get them both in. The first being, and I'll give you a little context, for many years, businesses have externalized many of the environmental impact costs that arise from the production of their products, their use and or disposal. We see that, again, especially in the aviation aerospace arena. Do you anticipate seeing moves away from that to have that retail pricing reflect more of the total life cycle costs to society as a whole? So essentially drilling it down to an individual consumer question mark.
That's baked into the regulations that are forthcoming. If we just take, we're all, in terms of relating stuff to everyday life, we're all wearing clothes. Let's think about the fast fashion space, right? So you're heavily invested into an entity that's producing fast fashion, quite often sourced in the East. Kind of things that we think about there straight away are child labor. We also think about dye seeping into waterways and air pollution and so forth. Reality is that declared profit it's a fake profit if you are not rightfully incurring the costs of ensuring that you're not polluting waterways and not doing harm. Because ultimately, and it has nothing to do with doing the right thing. It's to do with the fact that, for example, the impact of, let's say, millennials, right? Enlightened self-interest on the part of the investor. Because the company that does that, knowingly, and there's evidence that they might just know it at a corporate level, but if it's known down here somewhere elsewhere in the world, then quite frankly, consumers will move, right? And it is known that consumers will spend that bit more to purchase a product at a consumer level that they just feel better about. So buying habits are changing. And the developed world, what's motivating people, our behavioral patterns are changing dramatically. And so ultimately, if you don't factor in, that's where, an example, you're factoring in the customer, you're factoring in child labor, you're factoring in impact on biodiversity. And in Europe, we have a thing called materiality, which is an accounting term, right? What's material that will influence me in my buying decision or divestiture decision? And so in Europe, they want this double materiality, right? Which is, we want to understand not just the impact that the world is having on the business, but the impact the business is happening on the world. And LCA, life cycle analysis, being factored into everything, goods and services, is now becoming part and parcel of business management. Sure, it's been baked into the regs.
So I'll just make one quick comment on that all of this is happening at a moment when we have this enormous and growing technological capability, that it was easy to hide these things in the past. It's getting much harder to hide them even without the regulations. And as folks are having to report deeper and deeper down into the supply chains, that knowledge and information becomes really powerful and can help move markets. And that's, I think, another factor about the behind all this that I think is very interesting and compelling.
No, that makes complete sense. And I think that kind of touches too, Mary, what you just mentioned on one of the questions that had come in, which is, really what's driving that? Is it the policy changes at the corporate level, or is it really the at a higher level, whether it's the state, Congress, or and exactly. And it speaks to the reason to have this conversation, to become aware. One of the questions that I don't know that we'll get too much time to cover, but I would be more than happy to share your thoughts with our audience after the fact is, for those that are interested in a career in sustainability and or, again, building that knowledge base and the resources within teams to be aware of the sustainable, any resources that you might share with our audience as being credible. Again, knowing that information is out there, credibility is of utmost importance, and also the credibility in those reporting. You mentioned that, Peadar, earlier in your conversation. So any resources that you can share with our audience in that space would be certainly welcomed. And again, we'll continue this conversation in upcoming events. With that being said, at this point, I'll, again, from my perspective, thank you both, Mary and Peadar, for joining in our conversation, just an introduction to the conversation today, and welcome you to continue it in our future event. And I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Sharma. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Peadar and Mary, I want to say, I don't think 1 hour does justice to this topic and the wonderful presentation that both of you have done. I think I'm going to walk home today with a few less hair, because I'm going to be pulling my hair out, trying to understand the complexity of all that you've shared. It's just fabulous. So I want to say I've learned quite a bit in just a limited amount of time that you've been on the screen. And I know I'm running short on time, but I was just writing things like, I'm a finance person by way of background. So yeah, I found the question about finance quite interesting, intellectual property quite interesting, really from that. But, the questions that in my head are, it would be interesting, when we get to this place in the world where the ESG or the 6 assets, the 6 types of capital that you mentioned for financial is the most obvious one, is it would be interesting to kind of vision a world where these all 6 capitals become transactional in nature. That is, they're as liquid as the financial capital. So it's an interesting thought. Maybe for the next conversation, we save that discussion for the audience to think about, for both of you to think about. I mentioned that, and I'll just express my gratitude to both of you. Like Bitcoin is an attempt in a different way in that direction, but it doesn't quite have the traction yet. It's not transactable in every venue, every forum, plus so there are a lot of kind of concerns about this thing. So I found it fascinating, Peadar. So thank you for educating Mary. Thank you on the finance side, speaking on that subject. I think these are great questions, some of which we couldn't get to ask, but hopefully we'll carry this conversation forward. So with that, to the audience, I want to thank you, our wonderful guests, Peadar and Mary, for joining us. It was fantastic to have both of you here. We look forward to having this conversation ongoing. There's much to learn on our part, and undoubtedly much to share for both of you. And so thank you again for joining, Peadar from the great island country of Ireland, and Mary from the great Celtics city of Boston. I love the Celtics, so number one NBA team. And finally, to the audience, as we close out this edition of the Vantage Point, we do encourage you to join us next time or visit us on the ERAU Worldwide YouTube channel for on-demand recordings of these and the past events. So until next time, everyone, take care of yourselves, stay well, stay healthy.